Thanks for joining us today. We'll go ahead and get started. Go ahead, Becky, next slide. The whole purpose of our discussion this morning is just to make it a review for those of you who have trained before in how to identify those common organisms that are associated with laboratory acquired infections, but also could be used as a terroristic organism, or that we normally see in the state of Nebraska, like the Brucella, like Francisella, like Neisseria meningitidis. But do remember that they are endemic to this area. We don't get them very often. It doesn't have to be a bioterrorism event. The reason we want to go through it or go through a review is because you will be receiving the challenge sets. I believe about 8 or 9 laboratories in the state do get what is called the LPX, or Laboratory Preparedness Exercise. That is sent out by CAP, but I realize it's really expensive. So the laboratories that do not receive it, we provide what is called the challenge set. Now, I see the challenge set as a proficiency training. And next slide, Becky. And any laboratory that does gram stains in at least one bench, especially like Blood's bench, or if they do the lower respiratory tract or anything wounds related on their cultures, is considered a, well, sentinel laboratory, or at least a laboratory that I feel that they are obligated to do what is called the challenge set, or the LPX. Next slide. And the reason why is because since they are doing one of those, or if not all of those cultures, it's important they understand the process, just like you get a PT for gram stains or get a PT for any of your other testing. It's important that you know what to look for, you know the trigger points, because the greatest risk to any microbiologist, of course, is Brucella. It can be very contagious. You don't even have to be working on the culture. We have known situations where the next microbiologist over might have been working on it, but the person sitting beside them had come down with the organism. So other things that are very dangerous in the laboratory are Neisseria meningitidis, TB. If you're not careful working in the TB lab, they may not come down with a full-blown disease in TB, but they can become seropositive. Same way with Salmonella and Shigella. These are organisms that probably are don't have a high morbidity or mortality, but you certainly can get very, very sick from them. I have known microbiologists have gotten so sick, they ended up in the emergency room. So just going back on that slide, do know that Brucella in the clinical lab, you are over 600 times more likely to come down with Brucella organism than you are the general population. So definitely very important to remember. Next slide. So we always want to try to cover the important biosafety points in a laboratory that we all know so well, but we tend to just unintentionally do them anyway. So we will want to make sure that we wash our hands frequently, that we keep our hands away from our face. We cut or cover cuts on our fingers and hands with bandages. Avoid personal items, and that has to include our cell phone. And I understand as a mom too, that sometimes you have to have your cell phone with, but don't answer it. Tell your kids just to leave a message and that you will call them back right away. Oh, interesting. Now my all of a sudden my own presentation popped up there, Becky. Don't know why. Okay, but I'm keeping up with yours. So of course, if you need to use a cell phone, walk out, wash your hands, walk out of the lab, clean your cell phone with a disinfectant or alcohol wipe before you actually use it. So also remember that anything that that you work up, fungal, TB, and any of these rule out and refer organisms, you should tape. Tape up if you're going to just incubate them. This is a good reminder for everyone working on them that they have to work in the biosafety cabinet. Always use, if you for some reason have to centrifuge down the specimen, make sure it's in an airtight rotor that can be taken. The rotor can be taken out, taken to the biosafety cabinet and opened there. So you have to remember to work with all potential biohazard organisms in the BSL-3 even before you do the gram stain. You have to do it at the first trigger point you see. So that's why I say watch for trigger points. Next slide. So what are the trigger points that you want to remember? The biggest and most important one is that you have poor growth or failure to grow at 24 hours or after 24 hours, going on to 48 hours. Another one is, of course, rapid growth of any non-hemolytic gram-positive rod. If you remember, we'll be talking about Bacillus anthracis. You could be culturing it that night and it will still be much bigger than most organisms would be by the next morning. So if you don't remember any of these others, you have to remember those two, that if you have poor growth or no growth at 24, but then it might have slight growth at 48, or after 48, you have to work in the biosafety cabinet even before you manipulate the organism. Of course, there are a couple others. If you have no growth on the McConkey and yet your gram stain on your requisition says gram-negative rod, there's an issue. And if you have something on your direct gram stain that shows a gram-negative diplococci or gram-negative coccobacilli, definitely put it in the biosafety cabinet before you manipulate the organism. One other tricky one is better growth on chocolate than on sheep blood agar. Well, that's a good clue for Francisella, but sometimes that's an issue. Sometimes Francisella actually can grow on both blood and chocolate, just that it grows better on chocolate. Typically, this organism, if you were to passage it, would not grow on blood. Next slide. And Mary Lanning, don't hesitate to ask any questions. Throw it in the chat box as I go along. Don't wait until the end. It's easy to forget. And we will go ahead and catch those as they come up. All right. Now you have what's called the bench guide for the LRN. And there are several kinds of bench guides out there. Nebraska has its own bench guide, which is just geared to Nebraska laboratories because it's simply cut down. There are not as many cultures in it. Hold on, I'm so sorry. Yeah. What is going on here? Okay, yeah, for some reason, my own presentation is now trying to come up with vengeance here. But the other type of benchtop guide is also by APHL, which is definitely more in depth with some of the biochemicals you may not necessarily have in your laboratory. Now, what we do in Nebraska is we realize that most of our greater Nebraska, here we go again. I don't know if you can hear that, but I certainly apologize. Gosh, I don't know why that's haunting me. But it is something that you won't need all those biochemical, or you simply don't have those biochemicals. So we at least provide the most basic ones, and that is the motility and the urease auger. Most laboratories do have oxidase, catalase, and maybe even indole. Next slide. Oh, Becky, sorry, go back just one moment. I'm sorry. Because what I wanted to quickly mention is that these bench guides are divided up into families. And you'll notice that in each family, for instance, like the Bacillus family or the gram-negative rod family, which includes both the Pseudomallii and the Pestis. But it is it gives a description, a very good description of the gram stain itself. It gives a description of how it grows on blood and chocolate, and also if it grows on MacConkey or not, and gives a little bit of detail on what that morphology appears to be. So now you can switch, Becky. Sorry. All right, in that same benchtop, then we have a number of different images that share with you some of the common characteristics of that. For instance, here on the gram-positive bacilli, it talks about what specimens you'll see it in, what some of the characteristics are in the direct gram stains itself. Next slide. And so we will be going through each one of these today. Normally, when there are a lot more people, I go ahead and do what I call case studies and have everybody do their own case study and then share those case studies at the end. With a small group today, I'm just going to go through them, and please don't hesitate to throw a question in the chat if you have one. Next slide. So the first study we're going to do is blood culture that, let's say, it flags only 8 hours after collection. That's pretty fast. A lot of them don't really come up until probably 24 hours. So let's say it was drawn during the day, and then in the evening shift, they subbed it to blood chocolate MacConkeys. And as you know, gram stain would be done. All right. But what we're going to do is we're going to pretend that you are the bench tech looking at blood cultures the next morning. Next slide. All right. The first thing I must insist is that you always, before you open plates, before you look, gram stain that plate, before you do anything, I want you to look at your requisition. I want you to study that requisition first before you open those plates and look at the timeline. That's why it's so important. Because if you notice, it was in this particular example of a LIS a requisition online, you'll see that this is a patient who was drawn at 1 o'clock that afternoon, and by 21 something, it was positive. Again, you know, this is very fast growth. So at this point, you'll be very interested in knowing what the Gram stain is, and normally there would be a Gram stain result. But rather than you just reading it, I'm going to have you actually look at what they saw the night before. Next slide. So if you were working the night before, or let's say you're a generalist or not very experienced microbiologist, you guys are in Mary Lanning, I know, but if you saw this, what would you think? And I want you to type it into chat. What, if either Christy or Lainey could do that. Anybody there? Well, definitely a Gram rod. But is it a Gram negative rod? Actually, if you look at it, it is very large. Yes, good. I'm glad you say that, because it definitely is an over-decolorized Gram-positive rod. How do you know that, though? How, if you didn't have much experience, wouldn't it be very tempting to call this a Gram-negative rod? Well, couple of things. Again, number one, the size. If you're familiar with this size and the shape of it, it is definitely that boxcard shaped Gram positive rod. Also, it has a clearing around it. Thank you. It's got a halo around it. Exactly. Next slide. All right. So in other words, you're already suspicious, but without even opening the plate, and obviously sometimes there's going to be condensation on the lid and you may not see it well, but you can see good growth usually through the lid. We're going to talk about some of these characteristics and how they have very irregular edges. They have even what is called that comma-shaped look to it. Exactly, convex, irregular edges. And it is what is called that Medusa head look. Next slide. So obviously some of the trigger points that we've already seen, hit enter again. Yes, is first of all, think about it. It's a sterile body site. It has rapid growth. One more time, Becky. A large boxcard shaped rods, and it's easy to colorize. So you've already recognized these. It should be something that you know not to open up and take to the biosafety cabinet. Next slide. So obviously, as we just said, that's what we'll do. Now, why do we repeat the Gram stain? Because when there is any question, when you're not sure if it's decolorized or not, go ahead and repeat that Gram stain, but this time you'll do it under the biosafety cabinet. You'll let that slide dry under the biosafety cabinet. You'll either fix it in methanol or a heat block, and on only then go ahead and do the Gram stain. And I'm glad you mentioned the farmer. So I only talked about the time on that requisition, but if you also notice that that patient was in-house in the hospital in that requisition, probably in ICU or something, and that the history was on the requisition. Do you there, what LIS system do you use at Mary Lanning? Do you use Cerner? Do you use Sunquest? do you have another type of system? Oh, I've never heard of it. Okay, but you have Epic. But you know, you don't want to go into Epic every time you have an organism like this. I know it takes time. So in other words, are you going to go ahead and is there a way you can program your screen to show the diagnoses? I know I could program mine when I was in the laboratory. I always needed the phone numbers because I was working Saturdays, and invariably the doctor would need the patient number, and I'd have it right there. Next slide. All right, so when we repeat the Gram stain, obviously this is what we see. We see the very large gram-positive rods, but this time they have something else that you don't normally see in the direct patient. And what you see are the little central or subterminal spores, as they're called. And it's really, again, just a clearing. The spores are very clear inside. But the cell themselves looks the same size. It doesn't look lollipop-like, like some cells, some gram-positive rods can do. If you ever see that lollipop method, you know, or look, you know that's not a Bacillus anthracis because they just don't change their size. All right, next slide. All right. So again, just a reminder that what you see in the cell itself. And of course, the number of cells that have spores increase with age. It is an age-dependent thing. You don't see them originally in the direct culture. Next slide. All right, and we're reminded of that in the Gram stains, where you can see the decolorization here, like you did in that first slide. Sometimes if it is like a lung smear, you may not see many at all, but what you do see is comparatively large. Now, in a blood culture, what's really cool in the blood culture, obviously the blood culture allows for an organism to show its morphology, its correct morphology. So you would see the chaining and the large boxcar shape to it. Next slide. All right, I think those are just good reminders of what we see. Couldn't even see growth at 8 hours. And by 16 hours, obviously, is going to be a very large colony. One thing we didn't mention is that when you are in the biosafety cabinet and you go to touch that colony, you'll notice that it kind of sticks to the loop. It becomes sticky or tenacious, and it stands up like a beaten egg white. So that's also very characteristic to be ground glass and tenacious. Next slide. Now, as a reminder, some of the biochemicals we do, even when we are in the biosafety cabinet, we want to make sure that we keep enclosed as much as possible, especially for anything that is aerosolizing. So our catalysis test is most concerning. The best way to do it is not to do the slide test that you normally do for staph and streps. Here, you're going to want to take that tube, just a polyurethane tube, and and go ahead and put about 3 or 4 or 5 drops of your reagent, catalase reagent, your hydrogen peroxide, in the bottom of the tube. Then take your organism, get a little bit on your loop, but don't put it into the liquid. Put it up beside on the sides of the tube, before you put it in the organism or put the organism into the liquid. So with that, you will literally cap your tube first, and only after it's capped and enclosed do you tip the liquid into the side of the tube where the organism is and watch for bubbles. Next slide. Yes, and same way with motility, we usually, and thank you, no, go ahead and switch to the next one. Motility is important. Rule out methodology. Motility, the reason we send you our homemade batch or version of motility is because it's the easiest to read. Most commercial like Rimmel, they tend to be cloudy because they're semi-solids, and we kind of like ours better. So that's what we make every 6 months, and we send out every 6 months. So do remember when you do a catalase and a motility that you run the positive and negative control right along beside it. First of all, it's just nice to compare, especially when it comes to motility. So if you recognize these trigger points, what you're going to do is you're going to follow along on the flow chart that we have in our bench guides. Do not, and I advise you, do not use the key in the back. Do not use that, because that is really not, if you start doing too many biochemicals, it will be to your disadvantage and may lead to misidentification. So stick with your flow chart. Do just what it says. So in this flow chart, the only thing you need to do with a gram-positive rod, of course, is that catalase and motility. Now, if your catalase is negative, make sure your QC works with it, but then go right along and do the motility. The motility does need to incubate overnight, so it isn't like a 5-minute test, but it's so rare. We have not seen Bacillus anthracis in Nebraska. So it's quite possible that it is not this organism. However, if your motility is negative, you do not see it, and it's a definite negative or a definite positive. It's not going to be a brush look or an iffiness to this particular motility for Bacillus anthracis, not like some other organisms. So it's got to be a very negative test. And so if that is negative, you're going to want to discontinue working on it and to tell your supervisor what you have done. You might even call your infectious disease or infection prevention nurse to let them know that you're sending it to the Nebraska Public Health Laboratory. Now, as we get the stat pack up, we hope that what we can do is look at your gram stain with you. And Hastings, we do have a stat pack there, don't we? Or it may be put away now, but I'm pretty sure we do. And it took us almost 3 years to rebuild that system, but we hope to get that back up. Let me know if you do not have the stat pack system. Okay. All right. Next slide. All right, there are some other motilities. Yeah, I know it hasn't worked. I will definitely check with Pam Spilker on that. In fact, it's probably been kind of put away in a cabinet even, which is okay. Now, there's some other morphologies. It's sometimes not going to be perfect. Here's one where that ground glass is only on the edges, where the center is actually very smooth. So different strains of subspecies can look different. This is pretty rare, however. Next slide. I do want to, and you know, I won't go through this particular lecture, any of the symptoms for anthrax. You know, there are 3 that are cutaneous, lung, or through in the blood system. So so each one of them, it has a different I guess a turnout in each. So I'll let you study that on your own. Next slide. But I do want you to realize that some organisms that look big and ugly, as you can see in here, this is a slide of or image of the organism. Sometimes that is a contaminant, a plate contaminant. You'll see this without even the plate being streaked. It's just an ugly glob. And but it is non-hemolytic. And if you are concerned, go through that same process as that we just talked about on the flow chart. Next slide. All right. The other thing I wanted to really bring up is the Gram stain. I want you to have a means of comparison, because one time we did send out a challenge that had a listeria on it, had a number of people call it a Bacillus anthracis, because it does look rod-like, very small if you can compare it to a true Bacillus organism. But nevertheless, you can't, just because it's rod, like there are other rods, there's diphthroids, there's listeria, there's a number of other organisms. So you want to make sure that you have your size correct. Next slide. All right. So next slide after that. Now we're going to go through the next 2 fairly fast, but you kind of then get the feeling of how this works. Next slide. All right. So once again, we want to look at our requisition before we open our plates. What is the time frame on this? This blood culture was collected on the 19th, and yet, and it didn't grow. Let's see, collected, received. It turned positive the next day. Well, yeah, 19th, collected, received, 19th. Well, anyway, so you notice that the 20th, I think really that should have been the 21st. And then the 22nd. If we had no growth at day 1, but then tiny growth at day 2, that in itself should be a clue. Also look at some of the other items. This is a 3-year-old that's in PEDS ICU, again, very sick, has a lymphadenopathy, swelling of the lymph nodes. Does have a history of a hamster bite, if you're so lucky to have that sharing with you. But also notice treatment failure of ampicillin clavulanate. So maybe this is a kid that had this hamster bite. They've treated it several times and it keeps coming back. Go to the next slide. All right. So, all right, if there is nothing in the Gram stain, obviously the first thing you're going to do is want to Gram stain the plate. And if that plate, if that's the case, you should already be in the biosafety cabinet. So what does this Gram stain look like? And I'm going to have you go ahead and tell me what you think that looks like. And while you're typing that in, the whole point of this too is that you notice that, yes, it is gram-negative Coccobacilli. but that because there was nothing seen in an original gram stain, that being a trigger point, and that it didn't grow at 24 hours. You don't want to put this on the MALDI. You don't want to work with this on an open bench. You'll want to do the rule outs. So how we do it is we start with the whole family. Next slide. Of gram negative coccobacilli, and the ones that are included with the gram negative coccobacilli are your brucellas, your B. malleis, and your Francisella tularensis. There are some people that really struggle, maybe not with that slide, but that struggle with gram positive or gram negative coccobacilli, and sometimes don't know whether to call them gram negative bacilli or gram negative coccobacilli. Now, in the slide we had earlier, slide before, obviously it's something that is so tiny that it almost looks like grains of sands that you can't really tell there are cells there. If you didn't know it was directly from a culture, you would think, oh, that's just the broken cells of the red blood cells from the blood culture. But this is just organisms. So there's got to be something there, and it's just so tiny. But if ever there's any question, you can also go to the McConkey. So we are going to be adding this slide to our Nebraska bench guide. I really like the fact that you can divide this down into what I call families. So on the side of the gram negative coccobacilli family, of course, those 3 organisms I mentioned. But if it's growing on McConkey and it is a true gram negative rod, same size as all your other enteric organisms, then it could be a Yersinia pestis or a Burkholderia pseudomallei. So in our case, I believe that the requisition said that it was, go back to the requisition. Becky, what was it growing on? It doesn't really say, does it? Go ahead and next slide. And then next slide 2 times. One more. All right. We're going to say that this particular organism did not grow on McConkeys. And if you looked very detailed at the gram stain morphology, whereas Burkholderia mallei may be in bundles, may have rounded ends, may be slight or curvy, small gram negative rods or coccobacilli. This you can't even tell. If you look at Brucella has small gram negative rods that are faintly staining. Yes, ours is faintly staining. This Brucella also says may be slow to decolorize, can appear as gram positive cocci. We don't see any of that. Ours most likely fits the Francisella, where it's tiny, pleomorphic, poorly staining. Well, it says mostly single cells, but you can't even begin to tell it's single cells. And so it grows very, it grows on chocolate as kind of a whitish grayish colony. Takes a couple of days to grow. Now, it may or may not initially grow on sheep blood agar. If it's coming from blood, it may grow on the sheep blood agar simply because it's carrying the nutrients from the blood culture media itself onto the plate, and it allows it to grow. If you try to subculture that, then it won't grow on a new blood plate. And that's because it really needs cysteine, which you'll find in broken red blood cells like the chocolate plate. Next slide. Okay, so obviously put it in a biosafety cabinet. If you look at your, go do a couple of them now. There. So in the biosafety cabinet, you would use the oxidase the oxidase being negative right off the bat rules out Brucella. So of those 3 family members, Brucella is the only one that is truly oxidase positive. So we've ruled that out. And the catalase is positive, and that would lead next to a beta-lactamase. All right, so that beta-lactamase is going to be positive too. So next slide. All right, and as I mentioned before, that this organism does require cysteine. That's why you might also think to do an X and V plate. You may get this confused with Haemophilus. Haemophilus is different than the Haemophilus should be oxidase positive too. And your X and V factors are not required for. So anyway, you that is the one thing that people tend to really get confused with. Is this a Haemophilus? And they don't realize how dangerous of an organism this is. In fact, some people have the bad habit of trying to sniff the plate, seeing if it smells Haemophilus-like, and that is definitely a no-no for this organism. So even if you're pretty sure you have a Haemophilus, don't sniff it. All right, next slide. Okay. So you can see that it follows that you do the oxidase, the catalase, and then if those 2 fit, go on to your beta-lactamase. And if it were Haemophilus, it would be oxidase positive, catalase positive, and it could be beta-lactamase positive, but your oxidase will give it away, or it'll rule out Francisella, and you know it can't be a Brucella, and we'll talk about that real quickly next. The thing I wanted to point out is do take care in noticing that on the side, it does say here in the brown warning symbol, may key out as Haemophilus influenza, Aggregatibacter, Acinetobacter, Bordetella, Pasteurella, Brucella. And what it's saying is if you try to put this on a MALDI-TOF or any of the other identification systems, it's a pretty inert organism. It's not going to have a lot of positive biochemicals to go by. So it could be misidentified. If you come up with any of these unusual identifications on the MALDI accidentally, you really should take it back and do the rule out or identify it by another way. But in reality, we don't want you messing with it. We would much prefer that you not mess with the organism at all and send it to us. We can do a simple DFA and have it identified very quickly. Next slide. All right. Go ahead, next slide, because I'm not going to talk about the bite or the symptoms. So number 3, go ahead. All right, so reviewing your requisition. Now, I know this is going to seem really weird, but this one says possible exposure to a lab flask and culture kept by a boyfriend in an apartment, 38-year-old female who now is in adult ICU. So if you look at this one, this was cultured on or collected on the 19th, but didn't flag positive until as it says, the 23rd. Well, that means it took 4 days to grow in blood. That also is a clue that it is probably something more dangerous that you need to work in under the biosafety cabinet. So next slide. And no, nothing growing on the gram or nothing shown on the gram stain. But yet you have at, if you go to culture it and at 24 hours, it didn't grow, and at 48 hours, it has this real hazy growth on it. You know that this is something that could be significant and very much a trigger point. So next slide. Gram stain does look gram-negative coccobacilli, but think about it. There's enough gram positiveness that people have been deceived to think that this is a strep. And this particular organism, it did come to fruition that here, not more than 5 years ago, a couple of laboratories in East Coast had over 100 people exposed to this because they called it strep, viridans, not a viridans, they called it an aerophilic strep because it didn't grow on the plates very well. They thought it looked strep-like on the culture. And this is what this organism does. But this is actually a gram-negative coccobacilli. Next slide. All right. So once again, let's go by family. If it did not grow on MacConkey's, which this one wouldn't, then it would fall under the Brucella B. mallei and Francisella tularensis. Next slide. So what are you, if you go to those 3 organisms and look at their flow charts, the first thing you should always do is an oxidase. And if I said its oxidase is positive, the next thing you do is a catalase. And then you'll notice that of the organisms that could potentially be oxidase and positive is your B. mallei can be variable and your Brucella can be positive. Well, your B. mallei is going to be urease negative, but your Brucella is going to usually be rapidly positive. In other words, the trick to urease, don't forget, this is the one tube that you should take out of the refrigerator, warm it up before you inoculate it. Warm it up in your hands or underneath your armpit or whatever, but warm it up a couple minutes and then inoculate it with as much organism as you can. It's a slant. So you would be just inoculating the slant. You do not puncture the media itself. All right. And when you do that, you put it in the incubator and look at it like an hour later, and then again 2 hours later. Now, there are 4 species of Brucella. 3 of the 4 are positive, rapidly positive urease. However, one of them is going to take the full 24 hours. So if it is negative at 2 hours, just leave it in overnight. By the next morning, it might turn positive. And then you know you have a Brucella. Next slide. All right. So once again, following the Brucella side, you see that it has these small, faint, discrete cells and may retain crystal violet in the gram stain. The plate grows, blood and chocolate grow evenly. They're non-hemolytic, moist. Do work in the biosafety cabinet. If you repeat that gram stain again, it's still the same. Then do your oxidase, your catalase, and your urease. Now note there in the brown warning sign there, you'll see that it says that it may key out if you don't recognize it and accidentally put it on the MALDI. It can key out as an Ochrobacterium anthropi or a Psychrobacter or an Oligella urolitica or Bordetella bronnoseptica. These are all rapidly urease positive organisms and can be deceived as such. So any of those kinds of IDs, be weary of. Don't just call it that. Go back, do your rule out and refer. Okay, next slide. All right. And you can go on, there's the description of Brucella. All right, now I'm going to just walk through two more that are pretty uncommon. Next slide. This particular one, it just says fall on trampoline. This was a 16-year-old female showing up in ER, had a spinal fluid done. And it does have, growth rate, just 24 hours, small, which is about right. But non-lactose fermenting on MacConkey. So next slide. What family are you thinking of here? You've got plump gram-negative rods. Are you thinking of the Francisella, Brucella, and B. mallei? No, those are gram-negative coccobacilli. You're thinking of the two family that grows on MacConkey's. Next slide, which is that, as this chart shows, would be your B. mallei and Yersinia pestis. Next slide. All right, and of course it goes through the gram stains, and each one of those says that on the gram-negative rod side that it is bipolar safety pan look in the gram stain. Now that is nothing that you can really rely upon. Sometimes it has it, sometimes it doesn't. The other things that it may mention is fried egg appearance, or wrinkled. Those are things that might not show until 72 hours. So not, again, very reliable. At this point, all we know is that we've got a small non-lactose fermenting gram-negative rod. Next slide. Yes. So next slide. So what makes you think Yersinia? How can we rule it in or out as Yersinia? Take it into the biosafety cabinet and do our oxidase. And you notice the difference between the two. The oxidase is negative for Yersinia, positive for the Burkholderia. And so with this being oxidase negative, you're correct. It is Yersinia catalase positive and indole negative. Next, urease negative. Next slide. And we really recommend this indole, urease, and I'll talk about the motilities in just a moment. But we use the indole and urease to rule out everything, pretty much other weird organisms like the some of the other Yersinia species, Salmonellas, Shigella, things like that. But it's important to do the motility, and you do two of them. You actually do four, two of them being QC, of course. The other two, you put at two different temperatures. You put one at room temp, one in the incubator, and here's why. Next slide. Because if you look at any of the biochemical charts, you'll see that all the Yersinia species are motile at room temperature, except for pestis. So pestis has to be negative both at room temp and at 35. And so that's the way to rule out all other species of Yersinia. Next slide. Or yeah, Yersinia. Next. Oh, so before I go to next slide here, the thing I want to point out is, how is this a trigger point that might make you think, how is this not a trigger point to make you think it's just an enteric organism? Actually, the name has been changed here. It's no longer an Enterobacteriaceae, it's an Enterobacterales. Isn't it right, Becky? Enterobacterales.
I think it's Enterobacterales, but
yes,
quote me on that's how to pronounce it.
You know, it is. Things have changed so much that now that whole family name is called that. So And next slide really goes to point out that, it's oxidase negative, indole negative, and you can't really call it slow growth. So I can see where somebody accidentally puts this on the MALDI or on your Vitek or Microscan, simply because there's really nothing that gives it away trigger point wise. Some of these, like I said, some of these characteristics you just don't see right away until they're 72 hours. Okay, we're growing short of time. It is 9 o'clock. One more slide, please. Oh, again, obviously Yersinia causing Black Death in the Middle Ages. Next slide. So I'm not going to go on. These are available. And so we'll leave it as that for your challenge set. We usually limit it to one of those organisms. Although, did we get to Burkholderia? Oh, keep going, Becky. Maybe I had Burkholderia after the fact. Yeah, because, I never went through these before in the fact that they were never seen in the United States or rarely seen. Next slide. However, we just saw 4 cases of the Burkholderia pseudomallii. 2 years ago, it was a Walmart product that came from Mexico, had been contaminated with the pseudomallii. It was like a lavender air spray or something. This organism, again, very slow growing, bipolar, oxidase positive, indole negative. You don't have to open the plate. You can smell this the minute you open up the incubator, in the fact that it has that really musty or earthy, stinky odor. Next slide. And that's what the gram stain looks like. Definitely kind of that safety pin look. Next slide. And here again, your oxidase is positive, but your oxidase would be negative if it were a Yersinia. Next slide. Yeah, World War II organism, but as I said, we're starting to see it. Now, Mallii is one that is very uncommon in the United States, extremely slow. It sometimes doesn't even grow until 72 hours. But we know that it can be oxidase negative or variable. And that's one of them that you just, if it's that slow, you do not want to work it up in an automated system. With this, I know that, yeah, we're going to go ahead and stop there, because I think in my regular BT lecture, I go through a number of other organisms, but we're going to leave that for the actual BT on-site class that we have. That's going to be in August. We are going to hold that at NPHL, but we hope some of you can come visit us that day. I believe it's August 21st. Please let me know, Ben, Becky, if I'm wrong, but I believe that's what it is on the calendar, and it will definitely let everybody know. So, okay, question, would any of these slow growers grow faster in thio? I don't think so. I think it would take the 24 to 48 to grow in there, or at least to grow enough that you can see it in the thio broth. It may, I just don't think you'll see it right at 24 hours. And that's a very good question. I've never been asked that before. You must also include thio with some of your cultures as well. So, well, thank you, everyone. I'll let it go at that. And if you have any questions when you get your challenge set, don't hesitate to ask. We may not give you the answer of what your particular organism is, but we'll certainly try to help you out. So take care and appreciate you joining us. Have a great day. Bye-bye.